On behalf of the team of Cornell Cooperative Extension Regional Dairy Specialists and Pro Dairy, we would like to welcome you to day 2 of our Net Zero for New York Dairies program. My name is Casey Havicus. I will be your host today, and I am one of the dairy management specialists at Cornell Cooperative Extension on the North Country Regional Ag team. Our first speaker today is Peter Wright. Peter is an agricultural engineer with Cornell University. So looks good, Peter, and we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, so here's my outline. I'm going to go through a quick review. Then we're going to talk about manure storage strategies, because there's a number of things that we can do with manure storage to minimize the amount of greenhouse gases. Then talk a little bit about manure treatments, and then finally have a conclusion. So that's what we're going to do. So in review, dairy farms are really good. There's a whole lot of things that dairy farms do that are benefit to everybody, but they do impact global warming. Here's some information. This is recently collected data. Don't try to make it conclusive, but it's data that was recently collected from airplanes flying over New York State. I want you to notice that it's a log scale over here, so there's quite a difference between 10 and 100. And you do notice we can all blame the landfills, so there you go. Here are the CAFOs, and this one of these is actually a poultry farm, and one's a sheep farm, swine farm. But the dairies do have quite a range, and they have quite a range because of, one, how many cows were circled, what kind of manure storage was and how much was in the manure storage, and whether or not they had an anaerobic digester or not. So there was quite a difference that does occur. But we're in the spectrum with all the rest of them. And of course, this is easy. Everybody knows this, that agriculture does have an impact. This is EPA mentioning the impact, and manure management is a big part of it. And here's the data from that. And of course, dairy cattle are right up in there, particularly in the methane issue. As you remember from yesterday, though, methane goes up into the atmosphere, and then methane also is removed from the atmosphere through a chemical reaction up there. So it's the short half-life of methane makes a big difference in how it reacts and what it does. All the carbon that goes through the cow, though, is carbon that was created through photosynthesis, pulled out of the atmosphere. So it's the carbon dioxide we're not concerned about. It's the methane, which has a higher global warming potential than the carbon dioxide. So it's the methane. And as you learned yesterday, the carbon dioxide, when we bring in fossil fuels, it adds up, continues to increase. But the methane, we put it in, and there's a cycle going on, and it actually degrades and converts back to carbon dioxide. So it comes back out. Doesn't mean it's not important, and doesn't mean it's not something that we should go after. So dairy, of course, is a source of greenhouse gases. Everybody's identified that. Depends on which kind of farm and all that, whether the enteric emissions are the biggest. But manure management certainly is one, and so that's the bad news. The good news is there are things that we can do about it. I just want you to know this is airplanes out, and they were actually circling farms, looking at what kind of a methane footprint they might have in New York State. Also in New York State has a Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and they just came out with a scoping plan. In that scoping plan, they've identified cover and flare as one practice and anaerobic digestion as another practice that they might be emphasizing. It's a draft plan, so might take some time to get going. And as you all know, we need more research. Farms will need technical and financial help to do this. One thing that I was a little disappointed in the scoping plan was they didn't really look like how they would coordinate food waste with manure, which really has quite a potential of reducing New York State's greenhouse gas issues if we actually can do it. Little biology lesson here. I'm sure you're all aware of this. The warmer it is, the faster a biological reaction occurs, up through normal temperatures, right? Methane comes from the manure, is produced by a community of bacteria without the presence of oxygen. pH is important. So a low pH, you're not going to get much methane. A really high pH, you wouldn't get methane. Manure, though, is right around neutral pH, so you get methane as it is. And of course, methane does have energy, both for us if we harvest it and use it, but also for other organisms if they want to harvest it and use it. The aerobic also can work on manure, and the aerobic organisms can get even more energy out of the manure than anaerobic. However, they get the energy out and they use it. Nitrous oxide, another very powerful greenhouse gas, is also, though, produced by a community of bacteria. So it's not just one, it's a whole gang. Here are the equations for it, and you don't have to pay much attention other than know it all depends on how much volatile solids we add. This is a constant, and then the methane conversion factor. So in this whole equation, there's just two factors: is what is the anticipated methane conversion and how much volatile solids are there, and that's to produce the methane. For the nitrous oxide, also, it's the amount of nitrogen, how much nitrogen is excreted, and the emission factor. And so those are two factors in these equations that the IPCC uses to predict the methane emissions. There are slightly more complicated equations, but pretty much everybody's going with pretty simple, these simple equations. We use these simple equations to come up with a series of fact sheets. Here they are listed, and here's where you can get them. This course on the ProDairy website, and a number of fact sheets and a number of management scenarios that you can use to reduce methane emissions. Wait a minute. When we did it in 2018, we had factors from the International Protocol, Climate Change of 2006 and 2013, and we used these numbers. Lo and behold, in 2019, they came out with these numbers. They're not that different, but they are different. And then one other really critical thing is here, these numbers, remember the equations are simple. The numbers that you put in are going to give you the answers, but the answers maybe plus and minus 20, 30, 50%. That's kind of where we're at. So those were the ones for the methane. These are the ones for the nitrous oxide. And again, you can see that they're somewhat different. So the manure storage strategies we're going to use are these. We'll go back to daily spread and get up to compost. This is from a presentation by Whiteman and Woodbury. And what it does is it takes us back to 1992, when more of the farms were daily spreading. And when you daily spread, you end up with a lower amount of methane emissions. When we switch now to 2012, then you end up with much higher methane emissions because we've moved people from daily spreading to manure storage. Anaerobic digestion and methane production principally comes from liquid anaerobic systems. And when we went from daily spread to manure storage, we weren't thinking about it, but that's what we did, is we set ourselves up to produce much more methane. Of course, you might think, oh, let's go back to daily spread, but you know that there are significant water quality issues with that. And as we learned last session, there's trade-offs, and one of the trade-offs is management problems and also water quality problems that occur if we try to daily spread. So you want to reduce methane, you can go back to daily spread, but if you go back to daily spread, you'll be creating a water quality problem, which is probably more significant than the methane. So we do storage. So it turns out that storage can work if we have a crust. However, in general, the crust needs to be thick, dry. And so it's very seldom I actually see this on one of our manure storages, but there are manure storages that do this. Some do it for odor control, add a straw layer, only never break up the crust and just pump from the bottom. And really the mechanism there is the methane is still produced, but the theory is the methane comes up through that dry crust. Other organisms grab the methane, it's an energy source for them, and then and break it down. So you can see that in 2008 in our fact sheet, we have a difference, right? So there's a reduction if you have a crust, and certainly it still works down here when we do the with the revised calculation. However, most crusts that I see in New York are like this, and this is not a dry, thick crust. So I think you're going to have to do something to actually put a crust on. And there's other, could be good for odor control, but there's other issues as far as agitation and that. So another really good method is to limit summer storage. Remember, the biological reaction is related to heat. And summer is worse than winter. We get very little. And so there are mechanisms now. We can apply manure in the summer. Here's we're putting it on a hay crop after it's harvested. And here's a, I'll call it beyond experimental, but more prototype of how to put it on a corn crop that's growing. There's also people that are putting on a growing corn crop. If you get it on early enough, the corn can take it. So there are mechanisms to actually apply manure in the summer to keep the storage, very, very little storage. You can see we have high temperatures in the summer, what a surprise. And then the available volatile solids, when you empty it in the spring, it slowly builds up in the summer. And then the methane that's produced is produced more in the summer. So if you can eliminate the summer storage, the methane production is much less. Here's some calculations that we ran on digestate, limiting the amount of methane, showing that the methane in the summer is much greater. Another thing that we can do is to separate the solids. When we separate the solids, half the volatile solids end up in the solid portion. And it's the volatile solids, remember, that are the factor in that equation that predicts how much methane you're producing. So once again, if we have a storage and we separate the solids out, and then we have the liquids stored, the total, you have to add these two together, you end up with about half the methane that putting it all in the liquid. And this makes sense, right? Because half the volatile solids have been removed. And in the solid storage, there's less methane produced. Notice there is some nitrous oxide produced. So you have to think about that. And then we did it again with the different numbers down over here with the revised figures, and we're getting about the same result. Noticed in these revised figures, I'm also looking at New York's global warming potential as they calculate it, which is methane is 84 times. Here I'm using 25. Over here we're using, I think 34. So there's, depends on what numbers you use, what you're going to get, but you get the general trend that separating the solids will definitely help you reduce the greenhouse gas impact. And if you're going to cover and flare, you need to separate the solids anyways, because there's no way you want to put solids under a cover. We have a hard enough time for the solids will build up under the cover anyways, but it's very hard to agitate under the cover, so you need to do this. And this is one of the methods that's being proposed through the CLCPA, and we can anticipate more of these. These will work as long as the flare works. And the flare can have issues. Remember, one of the problems with a cover, you're going to get high methane produced during the summer months and very low in the winter months. So if you want your flare to work, it's got to work in the peak of the summer, and it's got to work in the very little in the winter. And it's difficult to keep a flare, to have a flare that works continuously. If the flare's not working, your system doesn't work. And so the flare is a big part of it. The cover also is a part of it. We've gone back to some of the covers that have been put in previously, and we do notice there's leaks around them. One issue, and this comes up both with covers and anaerobic digestion, is people like me saying, oh, the cover, it'll leak. Well, the reason it leaks is because nobody has an incentive to not make it leak. And I think this is critical. If we're going to do covers and flares, we need the farm to have an incentive that the cover won't leak and the flare will work. And I think that's a critical component, just like anaerobic digestion would be the same. So cover and flare, and you can see we can end up with quite a reduction in the methane. Another thing we can do, of course, is compost it. The issue with compost, though, is you've got to deal with the idea that you need an amendment for the manure. Certainly you can compost the solid, then you still have the liquids to deal with. If you're going to compost everything, you've got to bring in carbon and a drier material in order to make the compost work. So there's difficulties there. The composted bedded pack, not sure, or again, I told you these are numbers, and this is what we had in the past. We had a high amount for estimated release for composted bedded packs from 2018, and now they're saying it's 0.5. Don't know if I believe it. Certainly, the better you agitate and aerate the compost in the composted bedded pack, the lower you get. But I'm not sure that these are completely accurate. I think classically more research is needed. There's also a number of advanced manure treatment systems that could help. All of these will reduce the volatile solids, they'll reduce the nitrogen, and so both of those will reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Vermicompost certainly can work to reduce the emissions. We have some examples of that. Pyrolysis, well, if it's only going to work for solids, but wait a minute, the biochar may be a way of sequestering carbon. So as you get into that, you can think about that. And then there's some experiments doing with hydrothermal liquefaction, which is we're going to end up taking everything and actually converting it into an energy product. So there would be very little greenhouse gas from that. Anaerobic digestion is one of the answers, and I think it's particularly one of the answers if we combine it with food waste. We do have to deal with the digestate storage, and we do have to deal with how are we going to deal with the energy that we do produce. We have digesters in New York State, and we have digesters already producing renewable natural gas going forward. And anaerobic digestion can significantly reduce the greenhouse gases depending on what the leakage rate is. And the leakage rate that they are now saying, and we have evidence even from Denmark, can be as low as 1% to as high as 12%. You can leak it all, really, if you're not careful. And again, I'm going to say it's really important. Where's the incentive? If you have incentives, you can lower the leakage rate, which really will be a big help. Also, you have to think about, where's the energy, how much value that goes, is replacing the energy, using that energy to replace fossil fuel energy. But there's also the parasitic energy that comes in, and there's can be a lot of parasitic energy, particularly if you have to clean it, compress it, and ship it to other places. We went through a whole scenario of very different processes that could actually do it. And we ended up assigning in the obtainable one, we said, well, you're actually getting a value. If we valued the methane at about $50 a ton, that you ought to be able to get an environmental credit on electricity of 7 cents. The Public Service Commission rejected that idea. They didn't want to. Here's renewable natural gas and system. You just take it out, but again, then you clean it, either inject it directly or truck it and inject it, and then people use it, and you can get both the RINs and you get if you ship it to California, you get their carbon credit too, and it can be very lucrative. The intensity is quite high. This is where the dairy farms would play out. They have systems where they pipe it all to a central point and then produce it. You get these credits. It is very, very lucrative. So that's why people are doing it. The price varies though, right? It's supply and demand, so it'll keep varying. Here's an example of one farm that has had a deal, and every farm is going to be different depending on what kind of capital costs they had to put in and what the CI score, the value going out. Be careful in any of these. If you want to get carbon credits, you got to monitor it, you got to validate it, and you got to verify it. And that is a tremendous expense and very complex. So it's hard to do. A lot of chance for food waste. I think we're missing the boat if we don't hook the waste food up with dairy farms, both to feed the animals and then also to run it through anaerobic digestion to collect both the energy and the nutrients from it. We have fact sheets on that as well. Here's the example, or this is the issue with food waste. Reduce it, save it for people. And finally, if you can keep it out of the landfills, that's where you have a problem. We're here, if you anaerobic digest it, it is a value. Here is the greenhouse gas reductions, daily spread, long-term manure storage, solid separation. This is covered with a flare with some leaks in the flare, anaerobic digestion by itself, anaerobic digestion and covering the digestate. But if we add food waste, we get a tremendous benefit from that. Now, if we use the New York State 84, we end up with a even greater benefit from that. There's issues with co-digestion, though. You got to bring it on. There's a number of climate issues that we have to deal with, and it's happening now. And as a dairy farm, I think we do have to think, what are we going to do for that?